Well, welcome to the session. I'm just going to start with a couple of slides to talk about how to get the best out of the session. And to do so, I'm just going to switch to, can everyone see the slides? It should say, is your audio working? Just make sure you press the mute microphone there. I think it hasn't, but I'm not hearing any feedback, so it should be okay. I've probably got half an hour or so content, so I don't want to too much of your lunchtime up, and hopefully we'll be able to do a couple of discussions in the little chat box here. In fact, if you have a look at the chat box on the right there should be at the bottom a little box for you to type into. So from me saying test, you could just pop a little message below and be where you're from. Just introduce yourself to everyone else in the room. That would be very cool. Alternative, that this chat function isn't working. Excellent. There we go. TCU, Sheffield Hallam, Bath Union, King's College Union, Lancaster, Bristol, and I think as well. I hope everyone can see those chats, and feel free at any point as I'm going through. I don't mind if you just want to interrupt and ask a question, pop into that chat box there and I'll see it pop up on my screen and answer any questions that you've got. Alternatively, there's that little hands up button which is next to the green tick, which I'll see as well, and I'll just stop for a minute to answer a question or clarification. That's not a problem. We'll just get into the main content then. So I'll start off just by saying my name is Tobin. I work for the Student Engagement Partnership. There's a little box there. We support, develop and promote student engagement activity in the higher education sector in England. So work in the NUS, but we're externally from Education Funding Council and others such as QAA, Guild-A, and the Association of Colleges to sort of specialist work and doing a lot of support, if we can, staff, particularly in roles such as your own, work sort of representation, student voice, student engagement, sort of in both student unions and institutions. We've just been asked for a couple of more on various issues. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about how you might approach finding out evidence, and in particular how actually you can use student volunteers in that process in various different ways as well. So today, have a look at assessing the role of research in making change in education, consider the range of roles for students within that research, explore different forms of research practice, think through a problem that might be addressed through student-led research, or I'll probably let you do that afterwards, and then address concerns and any questions that you can raise. As I say, you can use the chat box to do that. Quick slide to pick up the context that I'm talking about for some of the worked examples that I'll talk about in this session of using in our work. It's a diagram to demonstrate what I'm talking about with student engagement in particular. So the three circles here represent the different sort of of what we're talking about when we're talking about student engagement. So in our autonomy, we're talking about all sorts of things that we do that are around supporting learning outcomes, engagement in and with learning and environments. Change agency, which is basically the concept that we're in an institution where student engagement is working, that students will feel that they have a voice and that they're able to change. And then community is the wider aspect of students being able to feel a sense of belonging, a sense of membership or collectiveness within a community at the university. So if we sort of stick those three things together, essentially, that's what we're talking about with engagement. So that comes feeling a sense of belonging and feeling a sense of change agency, sort of sum up a lot of the different activities that we talk about when we talk about student engagement, whether that's societies, activities, representation, and so on. So that's quick context. My question to you, if you could answer in the chat box, is why would we do research at all as our work in student unions? Or perhaps what do we mean by research? I wondered if you just post in the chat box there and just check where it says send to, and there should be a drop down box. Hope there's an option that says all participants, but if not, I will read out whatever people pop in anyway, we are recording this. So just a question to you, if you could pop in the chat box. What's the reason? Why are we here today talking about doing research? I'll give you a couple of minutes to see if we've got some suggestions. Oh, well, we've just had one in which says to strengthen arguments to make change in our respective associations and student unions. So that's sort of about evidencing campaigning. There's a next suggestion is we want to understand the student experience. What goes well for students, what needs to change, which helps to evidence this rather than just being something we assume. And it is to ensure that any issues presented to the institution are evidence-led and show clear student opinion. It helps us make sure we really understand what our members want and to focus our efforts in the right areas rather than our assumptions and the evidence base. Okay, so we've got a couple of different angles on why we do research there, which is a lot of which is about the evidence or evidencing the arguments that we have. Just about it in the context of what I was talking about. Those things you're saying are absolutely true, and to sort of show them here, if we're talking about learner autonomy, better engagement in and with learning, then it's a number of you have just said, which is that we can really go to our institutions with suggestions for improvements and being part of the process of about things like teaching and learning strategies, for example. If we have that evidence and have that knowledge of what it is that the student wants, then the community aspect, and communities produce and are organised around shared knowledge and action. So an interesting example of this is that a lot of places will put together a sort of social program, whether it's maybe talking about trying to create a community amongst hard to reach students. For example, a lot of unions tackle the issue of trying to create a sense of community amongst postgraduates without first going out and talking to postgraduates, doing things like focus groups or things like that. We don't necessarily have a sense of what is it they actually want from a community, and how do you build a community? What is their sense of community already? Where are the key relationships? Research really helps us shape the activities that we put together, rather than working off, as one of you suggested, perhaps working off assumptions that, say, you could put together various different bits and pieces like a structure and a couple of social events, and say that will help create a sense of belonging and community amongst, say, for example, off-campus students or postgrad students. Without that evidence to begin with, it may actually and then the wider issue of change agency, obviously, I think speaks to what you're saying about we have evidence to put behind the kind of work we do to make change in our universities is absolutely essential. There's a practical side to this as well, in terms of why would we use students in our research, and that is sort of demonstrated here in that, you know, it's quite a time-consuming thing, and student unions aren't generally sort of armed with staff, usually pretty overworked people, aren't we? Nobody has time necessary to do all their own research by themselves. A good tip here is that using students in research is that the institution will be keen on it, and more authentic analysis. I'll come back to this point, particularly if we're researching is the student experience itself, directed by people who are currently immersed in that. In research terms, gives you a more authentic part of the process. It is fair to say that it's fun to research as a team, and it will also create a space for you to focus on doing the actual making change, rather than the day mountain, is what I've said here. But we can take a lot of time, a lot of analysis, detailed work, and by ourselves with these challenges may not be the best way to go. So using students is a positive thing. A couple of you have said this in your response to the question earlier on, and research, I think there are two loud voices in our minds here when we're thinking about doing research, and it will be our members. Very often I found, I was working in a student union, that would sit in sort of policy meetings or annual general meetings and students saying, well, it's all very well you're doing this work, but where, you know, actually we want an evidence-based approach and we need to put work into that. It's quite a common debate, I think, at NUS conference, talking about an evidence-based approach. And of course, the sort of flip side of that, which is coming to the university, trying to make change. And the first line of defence is always, well, actually, where's your evidence? Where's your proof? That. One of the things to say today, though, is that if we're taking a sort of research-based approach to making change, there has to be a little bit more to the process than this. It's not just about evidencing the problem, evidence the problem, evidence the problem, and then suddenly change happens. Having a sort of theory of change when we're approaching various issues, and in different research approaches, at each stage of your campaign or work to make change is important. Perhaps, for example, the process may be more about evidencing the problem and looking at different stages and different ways research can be used, such as bringing in different perspectives. So you might, for example, have an issue. Let's see, a lot of people think that there's a problem with library. We do a survey as our evidence base that suggests a lot of people say yes, or a petition or whatever. We use focus groups to get different perspectives from different cohorts of different students. Some quite qualitative data in there about why different issues are the way they are, and try and really build up a set of data that shows a richer picture of why students are sort of feeling that there's an issue. So the change can be more informed by a greater data source. So you could analyse that and realise that you need to do another bit of but moreover, once you made change, the research approach sort of comes back in that you continually assess how it's happened, why it's happened, and what could happen. Students in this process. Well, I think I try to sort of boil down here how a bit of research happens, and broadly, it's a fact that it comes from somewhere. So the commissioning stage, it may come from a strength of feeling, it may come from a policy being passed democratically, it may come from political lead by student officers or wherever or it may come quite informally or rather more formally from a commissioning body that commissions research. So essentially there's a stage at which research sort of comes from somewhere, and at this point, in this arrow between commissioning and conducting the research parameters are defined, designed, and the process is agreed. Going out and conducting the research, there will be lots of different approaches, which we'll go into more detail in a minute. But this could involve doing field work, doing surveys, doing focus groups, doing essentially field work, and going out there and doing things. You then basically have a data set which is evaluated, analysed, put together and reported on. Now, there are lots of different stages here and different roles which we start thinking about and breaking down how your research will happen. You can sort of put yourself or the union or staff generally in different bits of this process and students in different bits of this process, depending on how you want to do it. And actually, the more you look at it, there really any stage in this has to be students. So it could be, for example, I'll put a couple along the side here. The commissioning process may, as I've already said, come from student with, or it may be perhaps that you have a committee or a group of students that would decide where money is spent on commissioning research, and the design stage here is quite important as well. So, for example, if you are managing the research yourself, with students in a focus group or something like that to help you design the questions. So, for example, if you're tackling an issue by going out and doing some field work in the form of focus groups or the form of a series of interviews with students, the important stage there in your research being valid, you have to put thought into how the original questions are defined. And this comes back to the question of authenticity. So if end result is that you want to produce a report to go to a major committee of the university suggesting some form of change, obviously one of the issues you've got is you've probably sat around with a lot of academics who know research inside out. And so it's quite a string to your bow to be able to say, well, you've used current students at each stage of the process to add an authentic voice into the process. So a lot of people, your research could fall down because the university would accuse you of sort of allowing bias to creep in. So that's easily done, I think, in particular for student officers who are quite politically involved in a particular issue, are wanting to gather evidence, go out and give interviews with students that sort of questions that are shaped in such a way that elicit the answers that you want to hear, will make a whole piece of research sort of fall down at the first hurdle. And so, here, for example, a member of staff sort of project managing a piece of research, perhaps using students to go out and interview other students, so acting as researchers, also as a group of researchers, actually designing the questions in the first place. It may be that you do that yourself and you just want to use their students to go out and conduct the field, which also sort of adds in that area of authenticity that I was talking about. Or maybe it's at the third stage that you bring students in and you say, well, we've done this work, we've gone out, we've found this data, whatever it is, but in order to help us interpret it again, so again trying to sort of remove the political bias, we've got a sort of group of random selected students who are going to work on a panel with us to interpret the data and make suggestions. So different stages of the process here is what I'm sort of trying to different ways you can use students in that authenticity to your practice. So a couple of worked examples of that I'm aware of, well, one of which I've done recently. So first is, I've seen in a couple of institutions where has each year a sort of dedicated pool of money, not vast obviously, but a pool of money is meant to run change agent projects. So they actually invite groups of or individual students to sort of tender to be accepted as a research project in a couple of months, focusing on a particular issue, going out, finding the evidence, and bringing it back to the union to do something with. And where they've used students in that process is obviously they're allowing students to go out and do their own research on behalf of the university. They have a panel of students and staff together, a sort of commissioning panel who take in the applications and allot the funds and give sort of support to the students doing their own research and bringing those reports back to the university. And that's a particularly interesting process. I think it's been quite successful, and in those cases the university has really supported that and or perhaps even given money to it. That's an interesting one. The other one I give here, this is what a project I've recently finished managing, where at national level we've been asked by the Higher Education Academy to report that sort of suggests from in which, first of all, forming an understanding of what is meant by independent learning. So this is what students do between lectures, essentially. How do universities support? It goes back to this issue of learning autonomy. How do students learn in different ways that doesn't necessarily involve sitting down in a classroom, which has been a particularly interesting bit of research to do. But in order to sort of do it authentically and not sort of fill it full of, the same sort of issue I was talking about, we didn't want to produce a report that says NUS says this because that's what we decided. We recruited first peer researchers. We worked with 12 different institutions, and we asked for students at those institutions, in most cases, so these were master's students who were working in social sciences, who already developed some skills around conducting field work, and in most cases their involvement in this project was actually sort of supported by a lecturer within that institution who saw it as a sort of personal and professional development opportunity. So that's really quite positive, and that's something that can be done if you're lucky enough to have social sciences faculty at the institution you're at. You may find that there are masters or lower early years PhD students who may have the time and wish to work with you on a sort of internship basis doing this. So we recruited these peer researchers to design a process and design a set of questions, and then they went out and conducted interviews with somewhere in the region of about 20 students at each institution. Out of this, we sort of trained them in gave a bit of training on how to conduct that field where most of them, as I say, were working in those areas already. We sort of took the data in then, so they conducted the interviews and they were recorded on. We took the data, somebody analysed the data for us, sort of in a raw way, and then we brought it back to these open events for all of the students that participated in giving interviews and also writing reflective diaries to come together and help us interpret the data, and that built into the final report. So, although instrumental in sort of managing the project logistically and the initial and final stage of the project, the actual sort of data gathering and interpretation of the data was very much led by current students who are currently involved in the area of research that we were looking at, particularly effective. So some of those different practices that we might involve in a research project that we're doing, it may be just literature analysis. So you may want, for example, at an institutional level to sit read through committee minutes from the last 5 years for some And some of you have perhaps worked on doing student written submissions may find that that's a bit of work that has to be done. That's a bit of desk-based analysis has to be done. Could be done well by students. Creating and analysing data sets out of existing data I've mentioned already. A textual or visual analysis. Conducting interviews is something that is a thing to ask students to do, or observations. Writing journals, I think, that's a particularly interesting one if we're talking about getting a sense of what student experience is regarding X. Then the group of students asking them to write reflective journals, and then interpreting all data you get back from that can be really interesting. In cases, I have to say, we do have to sort of incentivize this to make it. Although in the project that I just mentioned, people were only given £10 for each reflective diary that they did, but that was enough of a incentive to get. I think we got somewhere in the region of 120 diaries from students talking about their week and how they were engaged in independent learning practices, and that gave us a massive amount of data to analyse to write the report. Workshops and creative projects are also good examples of different research practices which you use. Questions which you probably want to consider when approaching an issue that you want to approach in a research way. So, as I mentioned earlier, define a specific question is important, and using students in that process is useful. What does the decent data set look like for the question, so that we can confident that it is meaningful? What do we need to do to guard against introducing bias? I've mentioned that a couple of times, so we can be confident that our findings reflect reality, and I think that's really what using volunteers is a great opportunity. What analytical frameworks do we need to help us organise and make meaning from our findings? This is all important stuff to consider in the design stage. How can we ensure that the insight we produce is actually sort of turns into recommendations or actions? There are lots of things that you can use students to do research into. I think that there's a couple here. Think about their lives and communities, things about learning and the support for learning, things about how the university or college works, and things about the wider world that students are concerned about. So really, that's things, and I think that there are very few limits on what we can use to research into. Now, I know I've just been talking solidly for about 25 minutes, so I'm going to take a pause. For any questions or any issues you wanted to pop in the chat window to clarify, or if you wanted me to go back over any of those things, I think maybe a couple of minutes to type before they open my screen. I had a question about a copy of the research report coming through. Yes, absolutely. It is not yet. It's currently going through sort of peer review. It's being stages before we're allowed to publish. And you'll be very excited to know that I'll be doing a webinar on that exact topic once the report is out. But I'd like to disseminate it a little more widely, particularly amongst staff working in your area, because I think it would be of great help to you. Also, institutions involved were extremely helpful too. So another question on with over-surveying of students, so to diversify our methods, particularly using more focus groups and with shopper activities. Now that sounds interesting. Anyone had any experiences of using the journal approach? Have institutions seen this as a valid research method? Just a question, I think, to the group. If anyone has, I'd be interested to hear as well, and it's a good question. If anyone else has done a similar approach around sort of doing journals, I'll talk a little bit more about what we did, and certainly I'd say that it is absolutely recognised as a valid approach. I think that one of the great things about the fact that sort of you're used to your benefit, the fact that you're in the context of education environment and constantly searching, using research to find the answers to questions and find recommendations as to solutions to problems. And if we take a similar approach, it's to pay dividends, I found, if it's done properly. And a great thing to do is really to familiarise yourself, and perhaps it's a good thing to do in another webinar, actually, to familiarise yourself with various recognised methodological approaches to research. And absolutely, the reflective journal process is widely recognised and used as a sociological research approach. And so, as I say, by outlining the way we did and using students was part of the sort of ethical approach to the research that we had. Using things like journals, it's just the same, I suppose, as surveys, but it's just making sure that your data set is wide and varied and rich enough. So, obviously getting journals from 5 students all in the same department might not be particularly valid, but does anyone I've had a couple of answers to that question. Pete is saying that rather than journals, try to use a photo elicitation technique to find where students feel a sense of belonging. That sounds fascinating. I'd like to hear more about that. Also, students taking pictures over a few weeks, and then we interview them to find the meaning of the photos. That's really interesting. Okay, and Chris, who says we have done journals for student inductions in the past. Yeah, that's a really interesting one. And also identifying for how students receive communications from the university, so asking them to log when they receive correspondence and frequency. Yeah, I bet that had an interesting sort of. Chris, were those effective? Did they work? Was he happy with that approach? A more human approach to our research. Yes, I think that's a really good point. So I think that the reliance on surveys out there, and that's going to get worse, I think. I mean, the Teaching Excellence Framework, all this sort of embodiment of enshrining of surveys within the ones that are going to work in the future, most likely. There are just more and more surveys all of the time. I think it's a good of looking more widely at how we can evidence provide evidence for the change that we want to see, but more evidencing asking 1,000 students what they think of something, but using these sorts of blended techniques like the photos, like the interviews, like the journals. You get a much richer idea of not just what the issues are, but why the issues are there. Issues are felt amongst different types of students. And also, you might even start crowdsourcing some ideas for how the change might look. Telling stories, as people find it easier, and there's a narrative you can visualize. That's a really good point. Right. So we're just about out of time. And I hope that some of the I've raised today and some of the examples I've worked through, general issues, might give you the opportunity to think about some of the issues you've got coming up, your work plans or in your sort of policies and different things you've got to deal with over the next months, and think how maybe a research project might be an in approach, and in particular how we can use students in the process. And I just want to sort of finish by saying, today is sort of just really giving you that time to think. But if you want to actually follow this up any further, I'm very happy to be contacted to take any of these issues further. My email's on the screen there, tobin.webb@nus.org.uk. I can point you in the direction of various things that would help with design methodology and issues around sort of authenticity and ethics in research and so on. And yeah, I'd be happy to take this conversation further individually with you guys. But thank you very much for coming today. It's a really interesting discussion as well. Is there any more questions? I'll just pause here for a minute. But if no, then I'll say goodbye and thank you for attending today.